first part of the hour talking about the Chinese in America, a narrative history, and then devote the rest of my time answering questions from the audience. Let me first tell you a little about myself and why I wrote this book. For as long as I could remember, I lived in two separate realities as a Chinese American: the reality of popular culture and the reality of my own personal experience. Popular culture told me that Chinese Americans were hopelessly foreign, exotic, and inscrutable. They were Fu Manchu, Charlie Chan, and Susie Wong. They were those buck-toothed cartoon figures with pigtails or lampshade hats on Saturday morning TV. They were those 7 Chinese brothers from the popular children's book who could withstand fire and suffocation and swallowed the sea in one gulp. They were obviously not American and perhaps not even human. But then there was the other reality I knew. As the daughter of 2 professors in the university town of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, immigrant scholars from across the globe, from regions like China, India, Europe, and the Middle East, would converge on this little Midwestern community, where they celebrated their ethnicity with campus-sponsored festivals and parties, while also working together to research important intellectual topics. My high school was like a mini United Nations in its racial diversity, and many of my classmates came from or later engaged in interracial marriage, as I would when I reached adulthood. So during the most formative years of my life, I grew up with the perception that while mass American entertainment might be biased, in real life, people can cherish their cultural heritage while also befriending each other and marrying each other across lines, across color lines, because that's what I saw and experienced every day. And I believed, as many people did, that anti-Asian racism might one day become a relic of the past. All throughout the 1980s, the major news media carried optimistic stories about Chinese Americans winning Nobel Prizes and flooding the best universities in the country and acing the Westinghouse and National Merit Scholarship competitions. The Chinese were called the modern minorities, the model minorities, moving onward and upward at an incredible pace. But all of this would change by the late 1990s, and for the very first time in my life, I saw the reality of popular culture collide with the reality of my personal experience, which destroyed lives in the process. The collapse of the Soviet Empire made China the second greatest superpower, and hence a prime contender for the role of America's new enemy. A Time magazine cover story implied that a new Cold War with China was on the horizon. And a deeply flawed report released by the Special Committee under Congressman Christopher Cox suggested that the PRC had been stealing nuclear secrets from the U.S. for decades. And the result was a major anti-Chinese backlash in the U.S., especially in the national laboratories. The most visible victim of this was Wen-Ho Lee, a Taiwanese-American scientist at Los Alamos Laboratory, who was accused of passing design secrets of the W-88 warhead to mainland China. After he was fired without a hearing and held in dreadful conditions in prison, the U.S. had to admit later that it had no evidence that Lee committed espionage, and also revealed the embarrassing fact that the W-88 technology China had could not have come from Los Alamos. During the Lee controversy, Chinese-American scientists who had devoted their lives to strengthening American defense with their technological research were being interrogated as if they were spies for the PRC. And for many people of my parents' generation, this was entirely new and unexpected. Previously, the worst racist episodes against the Chinese seemed to come from mainly blue-collar and poor areas, such as the Vincent Chin or Jim Liu cases, people who were killed in the streets by whites after confrontations in a strip club or pool hall. Now we were seeing an attack by highly sophisticated government agencies against a highly sophisticated strata of Chinese American society. They're scientists, they're engineers, they're high-tech professionals. And for Chinese intellectuals who had always been supported by the U.S. government in scholarships and salaries and research grants, for those Chinese who had spent their professional lives nurtured by our universities and national laboratories, this was a very frightening development. and it would only get worse. The anti-Chinese backlash climaxed in April 2001, when an American Navy spy plane on a U.S. surveillance mission collided with a Chinese fighter jet over the South China Sea. The Chinese pilot was killed, and the Chinese government detained 24 American crew members of the spy plane after they made an emergency landing in China's Hainan Island. Unfortunately, after 11 days of tense negotiation and a carefully worded apology from the United States, the PRC did release the crew, but not before the Chinese-American population had endured ugly and racist stereotyping. You should have heard the hatred that came over the airwaves. Talk show hosts wanted Chinese employees fired from the national laboratories, or expelled from the U.S., or even imprisoned, as Japanese Americans were during World War II. In Springfield, Illinois, 2 radio DJs urged the boycott of all Chinese American restaurants and suggested that all Chinese Americans be shipped out of the country, and even telephoned people with Chinese last names to harass them. Even newspaper editors indulged in anti-Chinese stereotypes during the spy plane crisis. In April 2001, Amy Liang, a Chinese-American college senior, was interning at the ASNI Reporter, which is a publication of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. The society organized a national convention in Washington, D.C., and Liang was assigned to photograph the performance of a comedy troupe during the opening reception. The troupe put on a skit about U.S.-Chinese relations, and I would like to read verbatim Liang's description of the event. White males impersonated a Chinese official and his translator. The official sported a black wig and thick glasses and spoke fake Chinese. Ching, ching, chong, chong, the man shouted as he gestured wildly. What was disturbing was not just the fact that this was happening, but that hundreds of editors, my future bosses, were laughing. I felt myself swallowed by all the loud laughter. Every time the Chinese voice became more jarring, the editors would laugh even harder. Despite feeling humiliated, I finished the job and turned in my picture. The next morning, I woke up crying. Those are Amy Liang's words. And the skit merely reflected the popular mood of the times. A year 2001 Gallup poll found that more than 80% of Americans viewed the PRC as dangerous. In another poll, a national telephone survey commissioned by the Committee of 100 and the Anti-Defamation League found that close to half of the people polled thought that Chinese Americans were passing secrets to the Chinese government, or that they might be doing it, and that was a problem. Almost a third believed that Chinese Americans were more loyal to the PRC than to the U.S. But then something even more unexpected happened: the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Like other Americans, I watched with horror the footage of the hijacked planes crashing into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And then, just as quickly as the anti-Chinese backlash had arrived, it vanished. Suddenly, Middle Eastern immigrants were the new pariahs of American society. And so, as I wrote The Chinese in America, I tackled a number of provocative questions that are central not only to the Chinese-American experience, but the entire American immigrant experience, such as, how can an ethnic group that is embraced by America and celebrated for its hard work and achievement suddenly find itself vilified? Why does it happen? How frequently does this happen in American society? And how can we stop it from happening again? When you read my book, you'll see how the United States, a country that prides itself as a bastion of fair play and justice, once shut the Chinese out from the gates of immigration and the law, and even turned a blind eye to the wholesale slaughter of Chinese Americans across the American West for more than a century ago. There's a perception out there that the Chinese in America started out poor and downtrodden at the bottom of society, only to rise steadily to the top. But the reality is that the Chinese, like other ethnic groups, endured cycles of acceptance and abuse, wild swings between xenophobia and tolerance. And at certain times in history, they were praised and celebrated as honorary whites, while at other times they were loathed and even killed their fate oscillated with factors beyond their control, such as economic and political conditions and the state of American diplomatic relations with China. If I may summarize these cycles briefly, we could look at the history of the Chinese in America as the story of three major immigrant waves of the last 150 years, each of which experienced great extremes of success and mistreatment. The first wave of Chinese, mostly men, came in the mid-19th century, the majority to join the California gold rush, although others migrated directly from other regions and to other regions. They were warmly welcomed when they first arrived because the U.S. needed their labor, especially during the Civil War. And as they filled this labor shortage, the Chinese made huge unheralded contributions to this country, such as building the Transcontinental Railroad, transforming the western frontier into land for agriculture, and they also labored in factories and canneries during the American Industrial Revolution. But the Chinese also faced a backlash, especially in California. White Americans began to view them as a problem as the Chinese population grew. In particular, during the economic depression of the 1870s, when white workers found it hard to compete effectively with Chinese capitalists and wage earners. In desperation, white workers organized among themselves politically against Chinese immigrants, and the ethnic Chinese soon found themselves demonized in the media, the subject of racist state legislation, and also forced to pay more taxes and license fees than any other group in California, while also not being permitted to vote or use many government services that were sustained by their taxes. They could not testify against whites or work for a public corporation, and their children were the only group to be denied a state-funded education. And matters would only grow worse when the Chinese actually found themselves demonized all the more, as California became a crucial swing state during presidential elections. Political parties adopted anti-Chinese platforms to court California. In Washington, officials found it convenient to blame the nation's ills on the Chinese rather than to have the public scrutinize their own corruption and their own acceptance of bribes and their collusion with big industry, which was rampant at the time. And so in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which would shut the gates of immigration to Chinese labor for the next 60 years. Other laws passed over the next few decades would lock the Chinese out of the country when they were visiting China, even if they had property and families in the U.S. They would force them to register with the government for residential certificates and even deprive them of the protection of the courts and bail and habeas corpus cases, and threatened even the privileges associated with birthright citizenship. Anti-Chinese riots and massacres would also drive many of the Chinese out of small towns and cities across the American West, and thousands left for China, never to return. The remaining Chinese faced government harassment and repeated assaults against their civil liberties, such as arrests in the middle of the night, interrogation by immigration authorities, demands for bribes by corrupt officials, and threats of deportation to China. And as they would discover, all it would take was one crime by one Chinese man to put the entire Chinese population under siege. When a young white girl named Elsie Siegel was apparently murdered by her Chinese boyfriend in New York City, the police forbade any Chinese person to leave the city without permission. And across the country, the Chinese were arrested indiscriminately when they stepped off trains or tried to buy steamship tickets. During their search for the killer, the police in Providence, Rhode Island, even forced all Chinese restaurants to remove the drapes from every room, stall, and booth so the interior could be viewed from the outside at all times. This case showed just how quickly the constitutional rights of the Chinese could be suspended in an instant during a time of government-declared emergency. And the cycle of acceptance and abuse would be repeated for the Chinese in the 20th century during the second major wave of their immigration. The doors to Chinese immigration opened up again after the repeal of the exclusion laws following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which led people in the U.S. to see the Chinese, and by extension the Chinese Americans, as the good guys during this Sino-American wartime alliance. Also, new legislation during the 1960s swept away the racist immigration quotas against Asian countries. Now, this second wave consisted largely of students and highly educated professionals, representing one of the greatest brain drain waves of Chinese immigrant talent to the United States. Many were intellectuals, capitalists, or bureaucrats who had held prominent positions in the deposed nationalist regime and who were forced to leave after or shortly before the communist takeover of 1949. A few of these people went directly to the United States immediately during the Communist Revolution, but many more fled to Hong Kong or Taiwan before later migrating to America to study or to start new careers there. Some were college students or graduate students who, during the Chinese Civil War, were stranded in the U.S. without a country to return to, and they decided to stay. But large-scale immigration from mainland China itself ceased when the PRC isolated itself from the world community during the Mao Zedong years. And just like this first wave, the second wave was warmly welcomed at first. The Chinese came at a time when the United States needed and actively sought immigrant brainpower as they entered the arms race against the Soviet Union. The U.S. federal government poured billions of dollars into research, into our national laboratories and universities, especially after the Russian launch of Sputnik made Americans believe they were lagging behind in science and technology. And so these new Chinese entered our universities, our corporations, and our defense laboratories, designing some of America's earliest rockets, developing powerful drugs and medicines, and fueling the high-tech and scientific revolution. In Silicon Valley and elsewhere, their contributions would help establish and maintain U.S. supremacy in the information age. And some became extraordinarily successful, as you know, as Nobel laureates and CEOs and pioneers in their fields. But it wasn't always smooth sailing for this group. When the Korean War broke out, and when American troops clashed with communist Chinese forces, and when reports surfaced of white soldiers being slaughtered, imprisoned, or tortured in POW camps, the Chinese in America were quickly considered the bad guys, as the Japanese Americans had been a few years earlier. And reports began to surface of ethnic Chinese being physically attacked and their property vandalized. And the Chinese Americans who were suspected of being communist sympathizers found their mail opened and their phone lines tapped and their movements shadowed in the streets by government agents. The U.S. government even considered proposals to incarcerate the Chinese in concentration camps and even allocated money to set up detention centers. One person whose career in the U.S. was destroyed by the anti-Chinese hysteria was Qianhu Shen, a visionary Caltech professor of aeronautics and the subject of my first book, Threat of the Silkworm. During World War II, Dr. Qian had worked on secret military projects resulting in the production of some of America's first military missiles. And he was also one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. But during the McCarthy years, he was falsely accused of being a communist and possibly a spy, mainly because some of his friends at Caltech had belonged to a secret socialist club during the 1930s. And unfortunately for Qian, this accusation came when the United States was entering one of its most paranoid eras in history. China had fallen to the communists. The Russians had successfully detonated their first nuclear bomb, and the evidence suggested that there was a British and American spy ring that had helped pass some of the atomic secrets to the Russians. And the U.S. government and the public began to suspect that the whole country was infested with spies. And so after 5 years of investigation and virtual house arrest in Pasadena, during which time the U.S. government did not find one scrap of real evidence that Qian was either a spy or a communist, Dr. Qian was deported to China against his will as part of a secret government swap between the PRC and the U.S. for American pilots shot down by the People's Republic during the Korean War. And ironically, after being forced to return to China, Qian revolutionized the Chinese ballistic missile program, and also helped initiate the design of the Silkworm missile, which was used against the American armed forces during the First Persian Gulf War. So all of this suggests to me that many of these obsessive measures to promote security tend to produce the opposite effect. History would repeat itself once again during the third wave of Chinese immigration, which occurred after the U.S. resumed diplomatic relations with the PRC. Business boomed in China, and tens of thousands of Chinese scholars, as well as people from all socioeconomic classes, came to the United States. However, as I discussed before, the disintegration of the Soviet Empire and the rise of China as the world's second major superpower raised concerns among some groups that China would soon rival the United States. And it's interesting to note that during this time, new legislation was passed to make it very difficult for many Chinese immigrants and immigrants of other races to effectively compete with American-born citizens. The Immigration Act of 1990 introduced the H-1B visa program for highly educated and skilled immigrant workers, but they restricted the time that such visa holders could work in the U.S. to a maximum of 6 years. Of course, critics of this program called it white-collar servitude or high-tech coolieism because a disproportionate number of these H-1B visa holders were Chinese. And as the 1990s progressed, the U.S. government feared that ethnic Chinese scientists would pass military secrets to the PRC, as seen in the Wenho Lee case. Since the past is prologue, we have to look to history to understand how and why the Chinese and other groups face these cycles of persecution and also acceptance. I'd like to share with you some of my theories and conclusions. My research suggests to me that the real driving forces behind racism is not something that depends merely on physical or cultural differences. The appearance of the Chinese, the shape of their eyes, the darkness of their skin, their black hair, did not offend most white people or bring out their most xenophobic impulses until certain conditions came into play. And I think these conditions usually require a political or economic crisis. The Exclusion Act had emerged out of the Depression of the 1870s. The anti-Chinese witch hunts of the McCarthy years came after mainland China turned communist, and the most recent backlash against the Chinese in the 1990s grew out of U.S. concerns that the Chinese would fill the massive power void left by the Russians. I think that the theme of crisis being linked to abuse and violence can also be found in my second book, The Rape of Nanking, which describes the mass rape and torture and murder of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians by Japanese imperial forces in the capital of China in 1937. As I tried to understand the root cause behind these atrocities, I studied other acts of genocide across world history, such as the Armenian massacre committed by the Turks and the Jewish Holocaust by the Germans. And these horrific acts all had certain elements which preceded them: an economic depression, the rise of dictatorships, and a racial scapegoat. Often, in order to consolidate their power, politicians will search for a common enemy as the means to unite the people, and a certain minority group at home or a perceived enemy overseas will be scapegoated and sacrificed. And in these situations, the powerful can exploit racism as a tool of social control to preserve the position of existing elites and also to hamper serious debate and analysis and serve as a smokescreen to obscure some of the larger and more deeper social problems in that society. And it's very easy to see how this could happen when people's jobs are at stake, when they feel threatened. They're often willing to give up some of their personal freedom for greater protection from the government. But as history has revealed time and time again, the choice to trade liberty for security is usually the most dangerous choice of all. According to the research of R.J. Rummel, for example, a world expert on genocide, it's not the genetic makeup of a particular people, nor a particular religion, nationality, or political philosophy that causes people to kill, but sheer, absolute, unchecked power. In other words, the more concentrated the power in the hands of an elite, the more likely that elite, regardless of its race or culture or any other factor, will commit human rights abuses both at home and abroad and initiate war with their neighbors. And according to the empirical data on the subject, dictatorships and totalitarian regimes are just by nature more likely to wage war on other countries and torture their own citizens at home than democratic societies, because absolute power will give people the ability to act instantaneously on those dark impulses that lie within us all. And the solution, according to Rummel, is to diffuse power through education and through democracy. Grassroots political activism will hold leaders accountable for their actions, and education and public access to government information will enable people to make informed decisions about their elected officials. I think democracy needs to be championed not as some abstract ideal, but as an actual preventative measure against atrocity. And what I found in my research was that the Chinese in America were very active participants in this process of democracy. And contrary to popular belief and stereotypes, they were never passive victims of injustice. What isn't commonly discussed in history textbooks is that they fought back time and again, using the tactics of Martin Luther King and Gandhi even before they had existed: passive resistance, nonviolent protests, petitions, boycotts, and court hearings. There was amazingly little violence that you would expect from a group that experienced such legal discrimination and even systematic slaughter in some regions. The Chinese went to the law, they used the law, and they fought for their rights. For example, during the 19th century, during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Chinese peacefully organized a labor strike against the Central Pacific, demanding higher wages and fewer hours and an end to the whippings that they endured by white foremen. And they did succeed in winning a few concessions. In the American South, where post-Civil War plantation owners had toyed with the idea of replacing black slavery with Chinese labor, the Chinese had hired interpreters to negotiate their contracts and sued employers if they violated them. They also sued white schools in California and elsewhere that refused to admit their children. They helped organize boycotts in China of American products to demand better treatment of Chinese immigrants by American authorities during the exclusion era. And they also pooled together their resources to hire some of the best white lawyers and lobbyists of the day to overturn some of the anti-Chinese laws. It was a struggle that would help lay down the foundation of civil rights law to the benefit of human rights activists several decades later. For example, Yikuo versus Hopkins set the standard for equal protection before the law, that any law applied in a discriminatory manner, whether to U.S. citizens or foreign aliens, is unconstitutional. Wong Kim Ark versus U.S. upheld the principle of birthright citizenship, which would prevent American-born non-white people from being stripped of their citizenship and relegated into a permanent foreign underclass. Many anti-Chinese laws disappeared from the books after World War II, but the Chinese Americans remained publicly and politically active. For example, during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Chinese American students staged sit-ins and demonstrations that forced universities like San Francisco State and Berkeley to establish ethnic studies departments. And since the 1980s, Chinese Americans have held huge rallies and raised legal funds to fight hate crimes, such as the brutal murders of Vincent Chin and Jim Liu. Chinese scientists also organized a successful boycott of the national laboratories after the US government engaged in illegal racial profiling tactics in the Wenho Lee case. Many of the legal rights and protections that we Americans take for granted today are the direct result of countless lawsuits filed by the early Chinese in the United States. But I'm afraid that the gains of a century and a half of activism may be wiped out in a very short period of time. The USA Patriot Act of 2001 and its sequel, the proposed Domestic Security Enhancement Act of 2003, threatens to destroy many of these hard-won American rights, such as our right to habeas corpus hearings, or even our right to retain our U.S. citizenship. Today, Officials are also evoking some of the most shameful legislation of the past to justify present policies in the name of security. A few months ago, Representative Howard Coble, head of Homeland Security Subcommittee, shocked the Asian American community by defending the imprisonment of Japanese Americans in the 1940s. He said, and I'll quote him, "Some probably were intent on doing harm to us, just as some of these Arab Americans are probably intent on doing harm to us." As you know, the Middle Eastern ethnic community has suffered great persecution since 9/11, in a manner reminiscent of the persecution of the Chinese American community during the McCarthy era and the exclusion period. People have been ordered off airplanes, harassed and attacked in the streets. There have been detentions without court hearings and deportations, and according to some of the human rights attorneys that I know in the Bay Area who are representing the needs of that community, some families are actually fleeing from the United States as refugees into Canada. This should not and cannot continue. You have to leave options open for immigrants. You cannot cut them off from the law. And when you do that, you're asking for outrage and mayhem and the flight of the best immigrant talent from this country. People need to recognize this not as an ethnic issue, but as a human rights issue. The dangers of racial profiling is that the government can use a divide and conquer strategy, suspending the rights of various groups one at a time until everyone suffers in the end. As long as any group is being scapegoated in America, merely on the basis of its cultural heritage, none of us are safe. The book I have just written may be considered an ethnic book, but it does contain universal themes of human nature that transcend ethnicity. We cannot leave the very difficult business of democracy into the hands of just our elected officials. Governments will not relinquish or share power until people force them to. And significant social change rarely occurs from the top down, rarely it percolates, rather it does percolate from the bottom up. So groups of all different races need to form coalitions with each other and reach out to each other, not turn within themselves. To be effective champions of democracy, all of us have to be more aggressive and proactive in crossing class and color lines. It means talking to our elected officials, educating them about our lives, and holding them accountable for their actions. It means writing op-eds and going to public protests when needed. It means networking with a wide circle of people, ranging from the victims to even the perpetrators of hate crimes, to understand the causes for their behavior. I think sometimes the most effective ways to resolve conflicts or just to prevent them from happening in the first place is to simply listen to other people and acknowledge their point of view, which are the first and very necessary steps required to start a dialogue. Since we're in all of this together as Americans, I want my book to be viewed not simply as an ethnic Chinese story, but as a quintessential American one. My personal identity as a Chinese American derives its force from my rights and duties and obligations as an American citizen. And the struggle to uphold American democracy, the struggle to protect human rights and civil liberties of all Americans, not just Chinese Americans, is an ongoing struggle for all of us and our descendants and their descendants, rather than a job that's already finished and done. So if there's just one message I'd like to get across to my readers, it's that democracy is not and was never a guarantee. It is still very much a young and fragile experiment. Thank you so much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions from the floor at this time. Yes.
A sec.
Thanks. Yeah, your very interesting talk dealt mainly with the relationship between Chinese Americans and the American state on the one hand, and Chinese Americans and the majority population in the United States, the white population. But of course, the United States also has very significant ethnic minorities apart from Chinese Americans, and particularly African Americans and Hispanic Americans. And I was wondering whether you might want to say a few words about the relationship between the Chinese American community and the other minorities that exist in the United States.
Well, it's a relationship that has evolved over time for decades. I would say that during the civil rights movement, Chinese Americans, particularly in places like the San Francisco Bay Area, worked with other ethnic groups to champion their human rights and their civil liberties. And there was an alliance actually between some organizations in the Bay Area with the Black Panthers, and also in universities such as San Francisco State and Berkeley, as I'd mentioned before. There was an organization by the name of the Third World Liberation Front, and that was a coalition of Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native American Indians, and African Americans, I think, as well as other groups, really to push for ethnic studies departments. And today we find also, I would say, some of these cross-cultural efforts often to promote civil liberties. So right now that there is a great deal of concern, I think, after 9/11, of the possibility that immigrants can be detained without court hearings and imprisoned. And Japanese Americans have actually been extremely active in that cause, helping Middle Eastern immigrant human rights activists, because it's an experience they deeply understand.
Just a quick question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the differences between the book that you've just written and some of the earlier scholarship on Chinese immigration to the U.S., because I think there have been a lot of books who've covered the experience thoroughly and also focused on various aspects and different periods of time in the last 150 years. And maybe you could speak about whether there's new research or a new type of angle that you've taken, or what is it that inspired you to write essentially a new book on Chinese immigration to the U.S.?
There have certainly been pioneering books on the history of the Chinese in America, and I think some of the path-breaking books came out in the 1980s. What I think distinguishes this book from some of the others is merely that it actually continues the story from the 1980s to the present. It also has a pattern of describing some of the conditions in China that led to the immigration to the United States, and then often then bringing the narrative back to China and following the Chinese as they come to this country and following the experience of their descendants. So the structure, which follows the three great waves, I think is different from how a lot of other authors have framed their research. Also, it uses a narrative style and approach which I think gives the person a sense that they are undergoing a journey with the Chinese Americans across American history. I would also say that this book tackles many of the controversial subjects that have emerged in just the last few years, such as the Wen Ho Lee case, and also many allegations of discrimination from Chinese Americans in the national laboratories, as well as also Chinese American and Asian American students at our leading universities who claim that they have often faced discriminatory quotas and policies to keep their numbers down. So all of these can be found all these subjects can be found discussed at length in my book. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to get some water.
In comparison to some other minorities in America, especially African Americans, Asian Americans are considered politically apathetic. I was wondering if A, you think that is true, and B, what are the reasons you think for this political apathy? Well, I think what distinguishes my book from others is that I don't really believe the Chinese have been politically apathetic. I think that there's that perception out there, but when I delved into the subject, I found that
the material out there really surprised me, that the Chinese were very active, often writing letters to politicians, lobbying for their causes, protesting the streets, and there was this whole body of litigation that you can find, in places like the National Archives, which is very much part of our legal history and set down the foundation of civil rights law. So there's a perception out there, but I don't think it's true. What I think is interesting is that many of these efforts have not been noticed.
Well, I want to thank you for your talk. I think the idea that some of the new laws are actually impacting some of the rights that Chinese Americans fought for 100 years ago is really great. I think that's a great observation. In the sort of scholarship now about the sort of litigiousness of the Chinese in the 19th century, there's sort of this unanswered question running through the scholarship, and I was wondering what you found and sort of what you thought about it, which is what the Chinese plaintiffs and some of the sort of money who was supporting the cases thought they were doing. We have very few first-person accounts, right? In those NAR cases, actually, it's very hard to figure out what people thought they were doing when they were bringing cases like Yik Wo, for example. Actually, what the sort of laundry guild thought they were doing, those minutes haven't come out. So I was interested in your research, what you found in terms of first-person understandings of what some of those legal challenges were about for them.
Again, some of this information, as you said, is very difficult to come by. And there's often much more that you'll find in the public record than often the diaries or maybe minutes, as you pointed out, or secret thoughts of many of the Chinese who live that. And that's the challenge that I think all historians face. And it gets excruciatingly difficult often to find some of this information as you move further back in time, for obvious reasons. And you'll see even just with information generated just a few decades ago, sometimes that's hard to locate too in China, especially after the Cultural Revolution when there were bonfires of personal papers. So, but here and there you'll find personal accounts, often in archives and in personal collections, and more diaries have been coming to light in just recent years.
Can I start? Okay. One thing that one can observe in the U.S. among the Chinese community here is a certain kind of racism among Chinese towards Black African Americans and other kinds of colored people. And this is an issue that one can really observe. And you notice that kind of thing, but it really seldom transpires in academic and popular discourses. And I was wondering the kind of efforts you try to promote in terms of solidarities among ethnic immigrants in the U.S., the issue of racism of colored people against other kinds of colored people should also be raised, and there should also be the kind of education of ourselves against our own racism in a way.
I couldn't agree with you more. I do think that all of these racial tensions need to be addressed. And if there's one thing I've discovered in the course of my research is that no one particular racial group is either, immune from being the victims of or persecutors of groups. So I think it's important to frame a lot of these issues in terms of human rights and to really look at some of the universalist causes for these kinds of tensions and racial impulses. I personally believe that often what often brings the xenophobic impulses in all of us right up to the surface are, economic and political crises, and that's usually necessary, I think, for the hatred to explode. And when in the absence of a lot of these crises, when there's a great deal of opportunity, people are often much more tolerant. So I think we just have to be aware of these forces out there that are sometimes right under the surface for these racial atrocities.
Hi. You spoke a lot about the obligation of the Chinese American community to fight for their rights and not let the victories of the past 150 years fade. However, when other minority groups do this, they're often criticized for distinguishing themselves from the majority, and by distinguishing themselves, undermining their assimilation and their tolerance efforts. So where do you think the Chinese American community should draw the line between assimilation and still trying to fight for their rights and maintain the victories that they've had over the past century and a half?
Let me see if I understand your question. You're saying that how do you maybe embrace your heritage and also assimilate and win acceptance from the mainstream population?
In part, there are a lot of minority groups that are criticized for constantly fighting for their rights, but in doing so, distinguish themselves as completely separate from Americans as purely minority groups, and in doing so, undermine efforts for the majority to accept them as Americans. And so where do you think that the Chinese American community should draw that line?
Well, I think it's important. I don't think they have to see these. I don't think they have to see an embrace of their cultural heritage and also their efforts to reach out to other groups as mutually, exclusive. I think you could do both. There's actually, as I mentioned earlier in my speech, I pretty much saw this happening in my own community, where people would have festivals often to celebrate their ethnic traditions, but yet they were working together on research projects, with people of different races. So it never seemed to me that doing one or the other would were contradictory. So I would think that the important thing is to remain tolerant. That while you have forums to discuss these issues with members of your own minority group, that you also make efforts constantly to reach out to other groups, regardless of race, and really see these problems as human rights issues, not just issues that are specific to a particular ethnic group.
I'm going to expand on the previous question. Do you think that the Asian American associations across the country maybe reacted too aggressively a year ago during the Abercrombie & Fitch incident that happened when they featured the offensive shirts, the line of shirts that appeared in their stores? There was a pretty aggressive reaction from many, especially student associations across the country.
Were there complaints then that the reaction was too aggressive? I remember seeing a lot of emails on the subject. Or do you feel that, I'm just kind of curious, was this later the subject of great discussion afterwards?
I'm just expanding on the previous question about where do you put the line between your cultural heritage and then assimilation. For example, Abercrombie has put shirts, I think, making fun of various European nationalities. I don't know of any Irish people complaining about Irish, humor and portraying Irish people in jokes. But at the same time, Asian people seem to be more offended. So does that mean that they still think that they're not assimilated into the country?
I think that maybe it's it came from probably years of seeing all of the stereotypes and maybe not speaking out, and finally there has been a trend of saying enough is enough. I think that people were so offended by the shirts with the saying no, two Wongs don't make a white, or I think that if an ethnic group is particularly upset and offended by some of these jokes, it's important to speak out, because you have to be honest to how you feel. And it just could be that, see, you've mentioned that they made jokes of other ethnic groups, that it didn't really it didn't evoke as much response, because many Caucasian Americans probably do not see themselves as foreigners, but or pretty much linked to a foreign culture as much as I think a lot of Chinese are stereotyped as still being perpetual foreigners. And I think that these shirts were pretty much a reaction to the stereotypes that had been building up in the media. So I think it was definitely important for the Chinese American community or Asian Americans to articulate their concerns, because there had been already at that time so much hostility in the media, especially after the Wen Ho Lee case. So it was important to bring this to the surface, and so I actually believe it was an important thing to do. You see, I think that an ethnic group that is concerned has to speak out. It shouldn't squelch its voices just because it's afraid of offending the mainstream.
Hi, I've got a question sort of linked to what you mentioned to be the driving force of racism, in that it's not just skin color and culture, but it's sort of like racist tendencies. In a sense, what you were mentioning, it sounded like racist tendencies were always there, but they're sort of kept under during good political or economic times, and it's only when you have a crisis that there's suddenly an eruption, and it doesn't seem like how many barriers or safeguards you put in place, but you'll find that even in 2001, you still have kind of a really serious backlash against a particular ethnic community of Americans. I was wondering, you mentioned that there was R.J. Rummel, who sort of had a solution about the unbalance of power, unchecked power. You sort of need to diffuse it through with education. But I guess I was wondering, what do you think if there is some sort of a solution to the problem of, as soon as everybody gets xenophobic, then suddenly all the racist tendencies come back, and we're allowed to intern anybody we want, and we're allowed to discriminate as much as we can? What can we do? It seems like history has shown that even throughout the 20th century, the Chinese still have been facing the problems. Is there some sort of fundamental change in legal or political agencies or economic agencies that Asian American organizations, the whole country, should be pushing for? I'm just sort of wondering.
I think individually everyone has to speak out. I'm not sure that to have like some kind of government-sponsored initiative would be enough. I think that everyone has to do what they can to address these needs, and I'm a big proponent of grassroots activism. I just don't think that a lot of these problems can be solved by just a handful of elected officials. There has to be a nationwide effort among people to stay on top of what's happening, and that requires an educated populace. If you don't have an educated populace, then people are going to be very vulnerable to the stereotypes. They will not question them, and when they emerge, they'll think that whatever is being purveyed in the media is correct. And I think that there has to be an ongoing effort among every individual to gain access to information, government information, which already is a struggle in itself, and then be able to judge it and evaluate it and act upon it. That requires education. It also requires a real civic commitment on the part of all Americans. Too often I hear people say, well, this is what's happening in the world today, it's all too big for me. I'm just a little guy. There's nothing I can do, and I'm just going to leave it up to whoever's in charge. That kind of mindset and impulse is extraordinarily dangerous because it's going to only encourage that concentration of power in the hands of elite that we were just talking about with R.J. Rummel's research. And so I think the solution is you're going to have watchdog groups constantly, monitoring the activities of those who are in power. Well, C-SPAN is here today. I would say that, for example, just the existence of an program like C-SPAN, which gives us direct access to some of these government activities without the filtering medium of the networks is an extremely valuable contribution to our society. But it also requires, sending off Freedom of Information Act requests to the government. Every time something develops, you want to find out where's the evidence, what's the cause of this. And what we're finding now is a lot of information that was once declassified in the National Archives are now being reclassified. The records of the Reagan administration now are not they're not open to the public. There are many disturbing trends that are shutting down access to the public's right to get information. And that all is going to hurt our ability to sustain a healthy democracy. And the only way to fight it is for every individual to speak out when they see something that doesn't seem to be proper. I mean, every individual has individual talents. For some people, it means meeting with our elected officials and having dialogues with them. For other people, it could mean protesting in the streets, peaceful protests. For others, it could be writing books, writing op-eds, or speaking on the radio. Everyone has their own unique talents, but I'm a firm believer of grassroots activism and kind of making things happen from the bottom up. So, and I really do believe one person can make a tremendous amount of difference. One book, one idea, one person. All significant change, I think, often comes from one idea and one person's decision to act against the forces of history.
Hi. I was wondering, what issue or theme do you think is the greatest challenge facing Chinese Americans today?
The biggest challenge today, there are many, but I would say that probably the biggest challenge is the sense that we're still often viewed as perpetual foreigners and not as real Americans. And I think the only way to combat that is to, as I said earlier, to exercise our duties and our obligations and our rights as Americans. We have to register to vote regularly. We have to participate in the American process of democracy. So and we have to network with other groups. We cannot just, I think, socialize and work with only other Chinese Americans or Asian Americans. I think that's a very dangerous thing. Worded apology from the United States. The PRC did release the crew, but not before the Chinese American population had endured ugly and racist stereotyping. You should have heard the hatred that came over the airwaves. Talk show hosts wanted Chinese employees fired from the national laboratories, or expelled from the US, or even imprisoned, as Japanese Americans were during World War II. In Springfield, Illinois, 2 radio DJs urged the boycott of all Chinese American restaurants and suggested that all Chinese Americans be shipped out of the country, and even telephoned people with Chinese last names to harass them. Even newspaper editors indulged in anti-Chinese stereotypes during the spy plane crisis. In April 2001, Amy Liang, a Chinese-American college senior, was interning at the ASNI Reporter, which is a publication of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. The society organized a national convention in Washington, D.C., and Liang was assigned to photograph the performance of a comedy troupe during the opening reception. The troupe put on a skit about U.S.-Chinese relations, and I would like to read verbatim Liang's description of the event. White males impersonated a Chinese official and his translator. The official sported a black wig and thick glasses and spoke fake Chinese. Ching, ching, chong, chong, the man shouted as he gestured wildly. What was disturbing was not just the fact that this was happening, but that hundreds of editors, my future bosses, were laughing. I felt myself swallowed by all the loud laughter. Every time the Chinese voice became more jarring, the editors would laugh even harder. Despite feeling humiliated, I finished the job and turned in my picture. The next morning, I woke up crying. Those are Amy Liang's words. And this skit merely reflected the popular mood of the times. A year 2001 Gallup poll found that more than 80% of Americans viewed the PRC as dangerous. In another poll, a national telephone survey commissioned by the Committee of 100 and the Anti-Defamation League found that close to half of the people polled thought that Chinese Americans were passing secrets to the Chinese government, or that they might be doing it, and that was a problem. Almost a third believed that Chinese Americans were more loyal to the PRC than to the US. But then something even more unexpected happened: the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Like other Americans, I watched with horror the footage of the hijacked planes crashing into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. And then, just as quickly as the anti-Chinese backlash had arrived, it vanished. Suddenly, Middle Eastern immigrants were the new pariahs of American society. And so, as I wrote The Chinese in America, I tackled a number of provocative questions that are central not only to the Chinese American experience, but the entire American immigrant experience, such as, how can an ethnic group that is embraced by America and celebrated for its hard work and achievement suddenly find itself vilified? Why does it happen? How frequently does this happen in American society? And how can we stop it from happening again? When you read my book, you'll see how the United States, a country to admit later that it had no evidence that Lee committed espionage, and also revealed the embarrassing fact that the W-88 technology China had could not have come from Los Alamos. During the Lee controversy, Chinese-American scientists who had devoted their lives to strengthening American defense with their technological research were being interrogated as if they were spies for the PRC. And for many people of my parents' generation, this was entirely new and unexpected. Previously, the worst racist episodes against the Chinese seemed to come from mainly blue-collar and poor areas, such as the Vincent Chin or Jim Liu cases, people who were killed in the streets by whites after confrontations in a strip club or pool hall. Now we were seeing an attack by highly sophisticated government agencies against a highly sophisticated strata of Chinese American society. They're scientists, they're engineers, they're high-tech professionals. And for Chinese intellectuals who had always been supported by the US government in scholarships and salaries and research grants, for those Chinese who had spent their professional lives nurtured by our universities and national laboratories, this was a very frightening development. And it would only get worse. The anti-Chinese backlash climaxed in April 2001, when an American Navy spy plane on a U.S. surveillance mission collided with a Chinese fighter jet over the South China Sea. The Chinese pilot was killed, and the Chinese government detained 24 American crew members of the spy plane after they made an emergency landing in China's Hainan Island. Unfortunately, after 11 days of tense negotiation and a carefully worded, while also befriending each other and marrying each other across lines, across color lines, because that's what I saw and experienced every day. And I believed, as many people did, that anti-Asian racism might one day become a relic of the past. All throughout the 1980s, the major news media carried optimistic stories about Chinese Americans winning Nobel Prizes and flooding the best universities in the country and acing the Westinghouse and National Merit Scholarship competitions. The Chinese were called the modern minorities, the model minorities, moving onward and upward at an incredible pace. But all of this would change by the late 1990s. And for the very first time in my life, I saw the reality of popular culture collide with the reality of my personal experience, which destroyed lives in the process. The collapse of the Soviet Empire made China the second greatest superpower, and hence a prime contender for the role of America's new enemy. A Time magazine cover story implied that a new Cold War with China was on the horizon. And a deeply flawed report released by the Special Committee under Congressman Christopher Cox suggested that the PRC had been stealing nuclear secrets from the US for decades. And the result was a major anti-Chinese backlash in the US, especially in the national laboratories. The most visible victim of this was Wen-Ho Lee, a Taiwanese-American scientist at Los Alamos Laboratory, who was accused of passing design secrets of the W-88 warhead to mainland China. After he was fired without a hearing and held in dreadful conditions in prison, the U.S. had the first part of the hour talking about the Chinese in America, a narrative history, and then devote the rest of my time answering questions from the audience. Let me first tell you a little about myself and why I wrote this book. For as long as I could remember, I lived in two separate realities as a Chinese American: the reality of popular culture and the reality of my own personal experience. Popular culture told me that Chinese Americans were hopelessly foreign, exotic, and inscrutable. They were Fu Manchu, Charlie Chan, and Susie Wong. They were those buck-toothed cartoon figures with pigtails or lampshade hats on Saturday morning TV. They were those 7 Chinese brothers from the popular children's book who could withstand fire and suffocation and swallowed the sea in one gulp. They were obviously not American and perhaps not even human. But then there was the other reality I knew. As the daughter of 2 professors in the university town of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, immigrant scholars from across the globe, from regions like China, India, Europe, and the Middle East, would converge on this little Midwestern community, where they celebrated their ethnicity with campus-sponsored festivals and parties, while also working together to research important intellectual topics. My high school was like a mini United Nations in its racial diversity, and many of my classmates came from or later engaged in interracial marriage, as I would when I reached adulthood. So during the most formative years of my life, I grew up with the perception that while mass American entertainment might be biased, in real life, people can cherish their cultural heritage